Frank and Rotarians and guests, we have a rather special guest speaker here today who has had the benefit of a broad and liberal education. He, in addition to which, he's had a very good tertiary education, which included from Le Cordon Bleu at the University of South Australia, and a Bachelor of Business, also a certificate in business operations. He's a very involved young man. He has been or is involved with the Australian Army Reserves, the Adelaide University Regiment. He's a practicing member of the Anglican Church and has been and continues to be a steward at the St Peter's Cathedral, which is the reason this room is nominated as the Cathedral Room. In terms of employment, working forwards rather than backwards, he has worked for organisations like the Observatory Hotel, the Oaks Hotels and Resorts, and finally, after about 10 or a dozen years of experience, joined the family company, which of course is Angus Clyne Proprietary Limited. And many of you know his mother, Leonie, who's the Clyne, I think, of Angus Clyne, but she stole the name from Robert. There's his dad, who is here today. So it is with a great deal of pleasure that I introduce. Two more things I should tell you about him. He's an honouring member of the Rotary Club of Unley, which are the other crowd across the way, and he's also an ex-Rylarian. And as you all know, you Rotarians all know, that's a great thing to be involved in. So, without any further ado, may I introduce to you Lachlan Clyne, who is the Mayor of the City of Unley, and I haven't even attempted to tell you all of the things that he's done in the last 10 years with the City of Unley because he wouldn't have time to speak. So would you please welcome Lachlan Clyne.
Well, thank you very much, Don, Sarah, for your introduction, and thank you, Frank, and to all of the members of Adelaide Rotary for having me along today to talk to you, I guess, a little bit about local government, where it's been, and perhaps where it might be going. Now, most of us think of local councils as a rather plodding and somewhat clumsy small p political entity. We lay the roads, we lay the footpaths, we look after the parks and gardens, and in most municipal country towns and cities, we're the ones that have the libraries and the civic centres. Indeed, the range of things that we seem to have been taking responsibility for the past 10 years seems to have been ever increasing and expanding at a rate of knots. And I think perhaps many of you who've lived in the one house for a long time will pay testament to that through your rates notice. And so we seem to have this somewhat sporadic but seemingly never-ending debate about how overgoverned we actually are. As a nation and as a state with 3 tiers of government. And I guess that puts a bit of a question mark over the need for local government in today's society. So let's look at the journey surrounding how we came to have local government. Whilst it is quite well known how we came to be federated with all the states coming together, whilst it's quite well known how the states themselves came to be a part of our government structure, perhaps the one thing that we're not so clear about is how it is that local government came into existence in the first place. What is this journey surrounding how we came to have the third tier of government is largely obscured by the mist of history. As a serving mayor, I'm keenly interested in today's systems of government, and as the son of someone who's a bit of a historian, I'm interested in understanding its roots. So I'd like to help shed some light on why it is we have councils in the first place, and in doing so I want to touch on just a couple of other topics. I want to touch on the need for political reform and perhaps talk about the issue of political apathy, which I think is somewhat endemic in today's society. To do so, I'll need to start my talk with one of the great topics of the pub, one of the great topics of the fireside conversation, and that's around the topic of potholes. And I'm hopeful that by the end of today's Adelaide Rotary Club's 4,511th meeting, you'll come to have a newfound respect for potholes. And indeed, as you drive around over the next few days, I hope that when you see them, you remark what an incredible impact potholes have had not only on your car, but also on democracy in Australia. Complaining about potholes has been an Australian pastime for well over 150 years. You see, the humble but incredibly annoying pothole would be the great irritant that in Victorian times would drive South Australians to such distraction that it would motivate them to form their councils and indeed continue on with them. The first fully democratic bodies were the Adelaide City Council, followed by the Melbourne and Geelong councils, but you see, these councils which formed in the 1940s fell over, and it wouldn't be until another decade had passed when those surrounding Adelaide were so annoyed with the quality of their roads that they decided to take action. But first, let me take you back to the first decade of the great social and economic experiment that was and is South Australia. It's hard to imagine in today's society, but in the 1830s, British, as we know them today, real estate agents and salespeople were able to entice investors to be part of the pre-purchasing of some 437 allotments of land that they were told would be somewhere along a stretch of coast, the other side of the world, and somewhere along a stretch of coast that was 1,600 kilometres long, that had been mapped by Matthew Flinders a generation ago. Now, these salesmen must have been pretty good at their job, because over the next period they managed to sell 437 allotments, and William Light arrived, worked out where he'd finally put the city, and then steadily went about laying out the rest of the allotments around that city. The land stretching to the south of Adelaide's square mile was considered the preferable land. It was less dusty and it was by far more fertile, and so it attracted the greater attention. The city, or the current City of Unley, was made up of 28 of those original 437 pre-purchased allotments, with each being 134 acres, the equivalent of about half a square kilometre. Of these 28 allotments, there were 4 main landowners. Of those 4 main landowners was a fellow by the name of Thomas Whistler, who would go about subdividing one of his allotments into 144 smaller allotments, which he'd then have houses built on, businesses built on, and you see, because Whistler came from that small part of England called Suffolk, he named the new real estate Unley, but because Governor Gawler or his staff were sloppy, they called it Unley. Now, despite the best intentions of the province's founders, the state's governors had been unable to deal with the growing demands of an expanding population. The economy had stalled and many labourers and farmhands were becoming somewhat destitute. The landowners had established their farms and market gardens on their newly pre-purchased lots to the south, but it seemed that no one had given any thought to how these people would get their produce into the city or further afield down to the port. Early on, the Governor had been quarrelling with the South Australian Colonisation Commissioners, the Resident Commissioner and the Surveyor. The Crown had taken back power from the South Australian Colonisation Commissioners, replaced the Governor and instead invested the power back in future governors. These governors were then inundated with the heavy workloads that accompanied the centralisation of power to a governor who's setting about the foundations of a new state, and the investors began throwing around accusations of incompetence and corruption as they saw the value of their investment gradually waning. Whilst there were these power struggles being played out at the top, no one was looking after the little guy. No one was there to fix the potholes, to create the roads that would actually get the produce into the market. These roads were vital to the investors getting their return on their investment. These investors and labourers who had travelled halfway around the world to make money, and here they were with an authority that was unable and incapable of fixing the potholes. The residents in the affected areas were fed up, they were exasperated and increasingly penniless. So what did they do? They started perhaps one of the greatest of the Aussie traditions, and they decided to have a pub meeting. So they got together on the 19th of September 1875 at the Unley Inn, which is the site of the present-day Bazaar, which is the Sturt Football Club's owned restaurant on Unley Road. Now, the chairman of the meeting, Mr Pickworth, observed that Unley Road had been the worst in the Adelaide vicinity for some years. He noted that the inhabitants of the neighbourhood had in vain endeavoured to obtain government funds to fix it, and that it was now impassable by cart and almost so for horses and on foot due to potholes. Mr White moved that this meeting considers the road between Unley and the parkland to be totally impassable, and that it is highly expedient to draw attention to the District Road Board to so great an impediment to all traffic. Mr Dorbenny moved the usual transit of goods upon this line of road being entirely suspended is severely felt by the inhabitants of Unley, Lower Mitcham, the Sturt, Coromandel Valley and parts adjacent. Mr Martin moved that the settlers located as stated, to whom the Unley Road is the direct line of communication with the city, are unable to bring the produce of their farms to market. The persons engaged in carting firewood and otherwise dependent upon the employment of their teams are shut out from their usual occupations, and their means of subsistence rendered very precarious. All motions were moved, seconded and passed unanimously. Did the government and the District Roads Board listen to the people? No. Were the potholes fixed? No. Did the residents meet again? You bet. This time, in a far more determined mindset, they were determined to fix those potholes. After 18 months of negotiating with a useless District Roads Board, they decided to meet again on the 18th of February 1853. They met in a school hall with much heated debate. The following motion was carried unanimously. that this meeting considers it desirable that a district council should be established for the Mitcham and its neighbourhood. So the citizens all signed their petition, which was sent off to the Governor, and the Mitcham District Council was gazetted on the 12th of May 1853. But it was, as you can see, rather enormous, covering a total of 108 square kilometres. Its representatives were not contained within ward boundaries and so were elected at large. And as it would turn out, the 5 councillors came from the centre of Mitcham and not from Unley, which was to displease those who lived in Unley. You see, dissatisfaction arose amongst the inhabitants of the town as the money wasn't being spent enough on fixing Unley Road. So the inhabitants of Unley met again, but this time without those inhabitants from Mitcham, and this time they determined to succeed, to break away. So with the required 2,000 signatures, the Unleyites sent their petition to the Governor, who agreed that Unley could break away from Mitcham, which he gazetted into existence on the 15th of June 1871. And so it would be that the newly formed Unley Council would see more than half its rates revenue spent on the fixing of Unley Road over the coming decade, fixing potholes. And so it would be the newly formed Unley Council was focused on potholes. With a bit of tongue-in-cheek and a slightly long drawn of the bow, I do hope that you can see, however, that the humble but incredibly annoying pothole has driven us to democracy in South Australia before the other states. And so we can claim to be the cradle of democracy in South Australia. The original inspiration for councils came from James Fisher, South Australia's first and only resident commissioner, who also was the first mayor of Adelaide, when he asked the British Secretary of State for the colonies in 1838 for elective municipal institutions possessing the power of local taxation for local purposes. In South Australia, councils were operating before we had a democratically elected state parliament. The councils, as you can see, were brought about because of local populations being desirous of getting things done that would produce solutions to problems in a timely manner, when the state was too busy to attend to such matters. Councils today have gone through great change. From almost 200 councils in the 1920s to today's 68 councils. Councils have always been empowered by laws, either proclaimed by the Governor or passed through Parliament. These laws have been written and rewritten 7 times and currently sit under today's Local Government Act 99. But because councils in each state sit under the Acts of Parliament of their respective states' governments, councils within each state are responsible for a wide variety of things. So let's first have a quick comparison of councils across the nation. As you can maybe just see, there are 3 different types of councils in Australia. There are the 3 larger councils, 3 groupings of larger councils, and then there's the 3 smaller groupings of larger councils. Western Australia and the Northern Territory were recently recognised as having the best performing economies in the nation, whilst South Australia and Tasmania were considered to have the worst. All 4 states actually fall within the band of councils that are smallest. The responsibility for the performance of any state's economy doesn't rest with local government, that's the state's business. And councils can be, whilst councils can be very proactive in assisting the economy, it is up to the states to make it all work. It's interesting to look at the staff to population ratios of councils across the nation. This table points out how larger councils find themselves employing more people. The Victorian example shows an increase in staff over a 10-year period from 2004 to 2014 of 71%, compared in that same period in South Australia, where there was an increase in 34%. Victoria has the largest average council sizes. In Victoria, there is one staff member for every 106 residents, compared in South Australia, where there's one staff member for every 152 residents. So South Australian councils, with an average council population of 24,500, has a greater staff efficiency ratio than Victoria's larger councils, with their residential populations of 72,000. Of all the state groupings of councils, South Australian councils are the most reliant on rates. Rates in SA equal 57.5% of the revenue, compared with Queensland, where rates account for only 30% of the revenue. SA generates just over a quarter of its revenue from other income streams, compared to Queensland, which generates 57%. You see, Queensland generates the bulk of its revenue from other services. It generates the same amount of revenue from other services as South Australian councils generate from rates. SA councils need to diversify their sources of revenue, or alternatively, cut rates and cut services. But I ask you, why would a democratic body do anything if the community doesn't want it to? And why would I say that? Unley has just put out its draft budget, and over the period of a month it received the one submission. Out of a population of 38,000 people, only one person got back to council to make any comment about the budget. In 2004, we raised $20 million in rates, and that was compared to $34 million in this last year. I just want to touch on political apathy before Don Sarah grabs the microphone away from me and allows you to step out of here. In 2010, Unley had 36,000 residents with 31,000 eligible representatives and 27,000 eligible voters. Of the 31,000 eligible representatives, there were only 24 people who nominated to be a representative on council. Of the 27,000 eligible voters, less than 9,000 people voted. Local government is the tier of government that is most flexible and able to respond quickly to the provision of infrastructure needs and services. But it is only as good as the people that get involved in it. I hope I've been able to shed a little bit of light on the history of local government in South Australia, and I hope that you take away the fact that councils in South Australia were the first democratically elected bodies in Australia.
Rotarians, it's time for a couple of questions. Do I have one? Over there.
Just a small question. You're proposing to put parking 2-hour limits in front of my house. And I have a problem because I come home late at night sometimes, and I don't want to go into my driveway because it wakes up my wife and she knows what time I've come home. So does that mean I'm going to get a fine each Friday night? Or are you going to reconsider?
Albert, I don't know what you're doing late out at night, but look, those should be not timed overnight, so you should be okay to park overnight.
Lachlan, thank you very much for talking to us today. I have to say on my part that anybody want to talk about rates? No. For my part, I've enjoyed it very much. I will never see potholes in another light. I now know exactly what they're all about. Down our way in the western suburbs, when we all got flooded all those lots and lots of years ago, we just simply redirected the torrents, built the west lakes and built the Patawalanga, and everything was all right. Nothing about potholes at all. But thank you very much. It's been great. We've really enjoyed it, and as a small token of our appreciation, inside this red thing, there's a big cheque.